August 15th, 1971. A Sunday evening. Most Americans were watching television when President Nixon interrupted every channel with a special announcement. What he said that night would reshape the entire financial system. Most people didn't understand it then. Few understand it today. But you're living with its consequences every single day. Because that night, money stopped being backed by anything real. And everything that's happening now, the debt explosion, the inflation cycles, the geopolitical realignment, traces back to that single decision. This is the story of how we got here, and why the system born in 1971 is now reaching its limits. Welcome to Financial Mechanics, where money becomes a system, and systems reveal power. What I'm about to show you is how a single weekend decision in 1971 transformed the rules that had governed money for centuries. How that transformation explains the debt crisis, the inflation cycles, and the geopolitical shifts we're witnessing today. And why understanding this moment is essential to seeing what comes next. To understand what Nixon did, we need to go back. After World War II, the global financial system lay in ruins. The gold standard had collapsed in the 1930s. Currencies were unstable. Trade was paralyzed. The world needed a new monetary order. In July 1944, delegates from 44 nations gathered at a resort in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. Over 3 weeks, they designed a new system. The architecture was simple but powerful. The US dollar would be backed by gold. $35 per ounce. Fixed. Guaranteed. Convertible. Other currencies would be pegged to the dollar. The dollar would be anchored to gold. And the United States held the majority of the world's gold reserves, over 20,000 tons. This wasn't just a monetary system. It was a framework for post-war prosperity. For the next 25 years, the system delivered. France called it the Trente Glorieuses, the 30 glorious years. Germany experienced the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle. In the United States and across the West, it was the golden age of capitalism. Growth was real. Productivity doubled. Wages rose in lockstep. A single income could buy a house, raise a family, and build a future. Inflation remained low, averaging under 2% annually. Debt was manageable because money itself was limited. The system had a constraint. You couldn't just print more dollars, not without gold to back them. Every dollar in circulation was a claim on a fixed amount of gold. That constraint created discipline. Governments couldn't spend endlessly. Central banks couldn't inflate without consequences. The gold standard imposed limits. And for a generation, those limits held. But by the 1960s, cracks began to appear. The Vietnam War was expensive. The Great Society programs, Medicare, Medicaid, the war on poverty, were expensive. The United States was spending far more abroad than it was earning. Dollars flooded global markets. And other countries started to notice. Foreign governments held dollars as reserves. Under Bretton Woods, those dollars were supposed to be as good as gold. But the math was becoming uncomfortable. In 1965, French President Charles de Gaulle made a decision that would change everything. He publicly criticized what he called America's exorbitant privilege, the ability to print the world's reserve currency without consequence. Then he acted. France began converting its dollar reserves into physical gold. Ships carrying French francs sailed to New York. They returned loaded with American gold bars. Other nations watched, and they followed. Germany demanded gold. Switzerland demanded gold. The Netherlands, Belgium, and others joined the line. America's gold reserves began draining. From 20,000 tons in 1950 to 12,000 tons in 1965, to barely 8,000 tons by 1971. Meanwhile, foreign governments held claims on over $80 billion. The U.S. had only $10 billion worth of gold left to cover those claims. The math was simple and terrifying. If every foreign government demanded gold at once, the United States couldn't pay. The system would collapse. Bretton Woods was built on a promise. That promise was breaking. Richard Nixon faced an impossible choice: keep the promise and run out of gold within months, or break the promise and change the rules forever. August 15, 1971. Camp David. A secret emergency meeting. Nixon gathered his top economic advisors in complete secrecy. The press knew nothing. Foreign governments knew nothing. Over one weekend, they made the decision. That Sunday evening, Nixon addressed the nation. His tone was calm, reassuring. He framed the announcement as defending the dollar against speculators. "I have directed Secretary of the Treasury, John Connally, to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets." Temporarily. That word mattered. This was sold as a pause, a negotiating tactic, a temporary emergency measure to stabilize the system while new arrangements were made. It never ended. 55 years later, in 2026, it's still temporary. What Nixon didn't say was more revealing than what he did. He didn't say the gold was nearly gone. He didn't say the U.S. had overspent for a decade. He didn't say Bretton Woods had failed. He blamed speculators. He blamed currency manipulation. He framed it as protecting American workers. But the truth was simpler and more fundamental. The constraint was gone. The anchor was cut. Money would no longer be backed by anything physical. No gold, no silver, no commodity, just faith. Faith in the government. Faith in the system. Faith that a piece of paper had value because someone said so. Fiat currency wasn't new, but a global reserve currency operating as pure fiat, with no convertibility, no backing, no limits, that was unprecedented. The largest economy in history had just decoupled money from reality, and the rest of the world would follow. But there was one more piece to this puzzle. In 1973, the United States struck a deal with Saudi Arabia. Oil, the world's most critical commodity, would be priced exclusively in dollars. Other oil-producing nations followed. This became known as the Petrodollar system. Suddenly, every country that needed oil needed dollars. The dollar's role as reserve currency was no longer just backed by gold's ghost. It was backed by energy, by necessity. The petrodollar gave the dollar a new foundation, not gold, but global demand for the one resource no modern economy could do without. For 50 years, that system held. But today, that foundation is shifting too. The consequences came quickly. Within 2 years, inflation exploded. By 1974, it reached 12% in the United States. Oil shocks compounded the problem. Stagflation, simultaneous high inflation and high unemployment, defied every economic model. The 1970s became synonymous with economic chaos. But something deeper had shifted, something structural. Government debt began its exponential climb. In 1971, U.S. federal debt stood at $370 billion. Significant, but manageable. By 2000, it had reached $5 trillion. By 2020, $27 trillion. Today, it exceeds $36 trillion. This wasn't unique to the United States. Every major economy followed the same pattern. Britain, France, Germany, Japan. Once freed from the gold constraint, debt grew without apparent limit. Because, without a physical anchor, there was no natural stopping point. Central banks could now create money at will. Governments could finance deficits indefinitely. The constraint that once forced discipline had vanished, and when constraints disappear, behavior changes. This is why central banks are losing control today. The system changed in 1971. Everything since has been an experiment in fiat currency, an experiment in unlimited credit creation, an experiment in decoupling money from scarcity. For 50 years, that experiment seemed to work. But experiments have limits, and those limits are appearing now. The constraints removed in 1971 are returning, not as gold, but as something else: geopolitical reality. The dollar's share of global reserves has fallen from 70% in 2000 to 58% today. Other nations are building alternatives. The BRICS bloc is developing parallel payment systems. China is internationalizing the yuan. Trade is increasingly conducted in multiple currencies. And the petrodollar system, the foundation built after gold was removed, is weakening. Some oil transactions now happen in yuan, in euros, in other currencies. The exclusive link between oil and dollars is fraying. The United States is adjusting. Look at recent events. The focus on Venezuela isn't just about democracy. It's about securing oil resources geographically close. The rhetoric about Mexico isn't just about cartels. It's about ensuring stability in the immediate region. The shift from expensive Middle Eastern interventions to Western Hemisphere focus reflects a strategic recalculation. The era of projecting unlimited power globally is ending. The era of securing critical resources nearby is beginning. This isn't isolationism. It's the return of geographic and economic constraints that 1971 temporarily removed. Britain authorizing the largest Chinese embassy in London. European nations hedging between the US and China. These aren't random events. They're symptoms of a fragmenting monetary order. The monopoly is ending, and nations are repositioning. The system born in 1971, one global reserve currency, unlimited credit creation, unchallenged American financial hegemony, is reaching its structural limits, not because of policy failure, but because the underlying conditions that made it possible are changing. 1971 wasn't just a policy change, it was a fundamental transformation, from money backed by gold to money backed by promises, from a system with limits to a system without them, from discipline enforced by reality to discipline enforced by nothing. That experiment is ending, not in collapse, but in transformation. New constraints are emerging, different from gold, but just as real. Geographic limits, mathematical limits, political limits, geopolitical limits. In the next video, we'll explore what those new constraints look like, the 3 possible paths forward, and what happens when a system built on unlimited credit meets the limits of reality. We'll examine the petrodollar's decline and what replaces it. If you want to follow how this transformation unfolds, subscribe to Financial Mechanics. The system is changing, and we're tracking every move.